Ja, einen schönen guten Abend zusammen. Schön, dass Sie und ihr hier seid.
Good evening. It's great to have you here. We really want to welcome you.
Industriekultur für wen? Die Auftaktveranstaltung für unsere
This is the
Tagung
launch event for our
Deindustrialization
event,
Studies.
and we are happy to be here in the U for this launch event, and we thank the city of Dortmund for being able to be here. And there will be a short introduction by the mayor of Dortmund, Mr. Norbert Schilff, and I'm asking him to take the floor, please.
Ja, meine sehr geehrten Damen und
Dear ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to Dortmund. You've been here in the Ruhr area for some time now. I'm very happy to be able to greet you here as the first mayor of Dortmund, especially here in a historic place. I'll be saying more about that in a minute. The conference already started on Monday, and I think I'm pretty sure that you have not been bored. When I look at your program here, then pretty sure about that. I'm quite delighted about the fact that the subject of structural change, which I've been involved with for 20 years now, has received a scientific component that's really important. And especially that this has occurred with such a lot of international participation. So that's also why I thank everyone very much who has taken up the subject and initiated this dealing with it. And if I already mentioned the Dortmunder U, and I think you couldn't have chosen a better place for this event, but I think you already visited my favorite place, the Zeche Zollern, which also has quite a lot speaking in favor of it. You couldn't have chosen a better place because the Dortmunder U is a symbol of structural change.
Kohle und Stahl war Bier. Dortmund war mal die Bierstadt.
Because besides coal and steel, beer was also an important employer. Dortmund was the #1 beer city for some time. Since then, a lot has changed. It suddenly became cheaper to transport coal from overseas than to produce it here in one's own country. The same thing happened to the steel industry, and then at some point, the big breweries were merged, and this cellar next door that used to be used to brew a lot of beer was no longer needed. Big change in coal and steel occurred in 1987. That's when the last mine in Dortmund was closed down. Since the beginning of the 80s, we have lost something like 70,000 jobs, and it took more than 30 years until we were able to replace these jobs with social security and benefits. So it was a long path for us, which I think we're quite proud of that in Dortmund. We managed quite well, but I think other cities did as well. And we started early to try to counteract this process, and I think, I don't know if you already heard about this week, I think something is unique in the Ruhr area. Unique in the world, which is a consensus between the labor unions, the employees, and the employers, the administrations, the associations, and the political sphere, which all shared and still share a common goal. And I think that really was a success. As I mentioned, we got 70,000 new jobs. Of course, they're very different jobs. A lot of them are in informational technology, communication technology, new technologies in electronic trade, and so on. We now have a completely new Dortmund, which shows a different face to the world. But also, I want to mention that as well, Dortmund, which values democratic engagement, equal opportunities, and also the efficiency of local administration. Only if all this comes together can a region be reinvigorated. And it's important that this is done also beyond the city borders. Change can only succeed if this is done with the neighboring cities and with the region, the surrounding region. So we are very proud, but we don't lean back, we don't relax, we are still at it and still try to shape good circumstances. And if all of this is now taken up in the scientific sphere and that happens on an international level, then nothing can go wrong. And I'm quite looking forward to what you will be doing in the next 7 years. I will be retired by then, but that doesn't matter. I will nevertheless watch with keen interest what you will be doing. So I wish you a good week, a good stay in this town, a good stay in the Ruhr area. Much success for your work. Thank you very much. All the best.
Ja, auch von meiner Seite.
So also from me, a warm welcome. It's great that you're all here.
Ich glaube,
I don't think we've mentioned our own names yet. Jana hasn't done that yet. So this is Jana Golombek from the Industrial Museum. My name is Stefan Moitra. We are both from Dortmund. We should mention that because we're in Dortmund here. First, I would say a few words in German for introduction, but we're quite bilingual today, so we'll switch to English soon, but then also go back to German in between. But we are happy to have simultaneous interpretation today, so that should work for everyone, hopefully. Because one research project is in the center here, the Depot project, which I'll be saying a few words about. Most of the people here belong to that Depot project, but there are also some people here who come from further broad war area. And so as an introduction, we would give you some information about why we're actually here. There are actually a number of occasions. One is that we are opening a conference here today, which will take place in Bochum tomorrow and the day after, under the title Deindustrializing Industrialization Studies. And this is the first event that we are doing under the title of this Depot project, Deindustrializing Deindustrialization and the Politics of Our Time. And this is a sort of a lighthouse project, a pilot project. So if you look at the research history on the subject of structural change, especially from a German perspective, then you feel that you're only dealing with your own case. You have a slightly blinkered view. You're not looking left or right. Maybe I'm exaggerating a bit, but over the last couple of years, we have started to look more across boundaries, national boundaries, and to draw comparisons. And this research has become more and more internationalized. And the Depot project is one actor in this process of internationalization of this research, and we've been at it for something like a bit more than 2 years. So Corona got right into spokes of it, but we are very much international now, with many countries involved and researchers and museums who deal with the question of how structural change and deindustrialization are culturally, socially, and politically relevant, what their effects are in these spheres. And that's what we're here for. And I think that's enough as an introduction. I hope I didn't forget anything that we set out to say in the introduction. And I would suggest that Jana does a quick round of introductions before we start with the actual conversation. We will be talking for maybe half an hour, three-quarters of an hour among us on the panel, and then open it up for the audience. And then at 9, at the latest, there will be a bit of snacks and drinks outside. I can't think of anything that you forgot, so I would just get right into things with the round of introductions. So it's a short round of introductions, and there will certainly be more opportunity to get to know the people here on the panel later in the discussion.
I would start with Stephen High. He's professor for history at Concordia University and one of the founding members of the Center for Oral History and Digital Storytelling. And of course, the initiator and director, or I don't know what the official title is, of this project. So we all wouldn't be here without his initiative. Welcome, Stephen, and thank you for being here.
Next one is Marion Fontaine. She's a professor at the Sciences Po. Quite high-ranking university in France. She is a specialist in labor history and I think started out with looking at football and the labor movement.
The relation between sport and working class in the north of France.
Yeah, so a theme very much matching, I think, with the Ruhr as well. And more recently, or actually for quite some time, she's been working on coal miners in France, and also under the perspective of migration and the more recent political undercurrents of deindustrialization in that context.
Yes, Hilary Orange. She's an archaeologist and art historian, and probably a lot of other things too. She is a senior lecturer in industrial heritage at Swansea University, and she's also co-founder of the Center for Heritage Research and Training. And she's a bit at home in the Ruhr as well, because she did a lot of research here on industrial heritage and the representation of industrial heritage, so she can really speak to the comparative part.
And now I switch to German again. Last not least, no, I wanted to switch. Nicht zuletzt.
I wanted to switch to German, now I did actually. So last but not least, we have two filmmakers here, Ulrike Franke and Michael Loeken. A lot of the people here saw their recent movie, We Are All Detroit, here in the Metropolis Kino. Ulrike Franke and Michael Loeken are among the most established filmmakers in the German documentary film scene.
Sie sich in den letzten
over the last 15 to 20 years, I would say, they focused very strongly on questions of structural change and questions of visual case studies
von Deindustrialisierungsprozessen.
Of processes of deindustrialization. They had two quite important and successful films, if you can speak of success in such a case. On the one hand, on the Phoenix Lake in Dortmund and the planning for that, and that also included some critical questions about people being moved out of the area, and
wo es die Kokerei Kaiserstuhl in Dortmund geht.
A second film about unmounting screw by screw of a facility that was transferred to China. And you now did the initial movie that draws a comparison between the car city of Bochum and the very classical car city of Detroit, and how these cities deal with deindustrialization. We have a bit of a trailer, which I think should come out now. For those who didn't see the movie, maybe 1 or 2 minutes just, so you get a bit of an impression.
Willst du die Welt verändern? Ja. Willst du die Welt verbessern? Ja. Dienst du den Schwachen? Ja.
Oh my God, it's all gone.
It's pretty sad. There used to be a real humming center of enterprise.
Schade, dass das alles vorbei ist. Ich war hier 35 Jahre. Man sieht heute nichts mehr weiter.
I loved working here. I loved it. It was a really fantastic, I think you say gemütlich, you know, it was a family feel.
It was really booming. It was jumping. There was people waiting outside to get in the place.
Und dann standen die vor diesem Tor, Hunderte von Opelanern, haben wir immer gesagt. Und wir waren alle glücklich. Arbeitsplätze.
Without so much, you could get a job that paid a middle-class wage. Enough to buy a house, enough to buy a car, maybe even a vacation home.
Viele Opelmeister sind mit ihren grünen Kitteln nach Hause gefahren. Ich habe das gar nicht so empfunden, dass mich das so mitnehmen würde.
The industry is based on profit, and as soon as it cannot profit where it is, it's going to leave, and it's going to leave you.
It lost more than 2/3 of its jobs. 100,000 empty properties. A city that was racked with crime and civil unrest.
Champion trifft Champion und Innovation trifft Innovation. Wir wollen Spitze sein und mit voller Energie Bochums Zukunft gestalten.
We have to be examples of what can be.
Lately, everything is coming back. New houses, a lot of young people.
Change is good, but sometimes change goes the wrong direction.
600 Menschen finden hier eine zukunftssichere Beschäftigung.
Kann man sich vorstellen, dass diese Arbeit eines Tages nicht mehr von Menschen gemacht wird?
Oh, das ist ja Wahnsinn.
Was ist das, die Zukunft?
Der Wandel.
Ja.
Okay.
So we'll jump right in. And we just decided that we wanted to know from each and every one of you how you ended up in deindustrialization and what is your personal take on it. We would start with Stephen.
Well, first of all, I want to say that I'm terrified by this format of sitting down with the lights like this, and I think it also speaks to my background as someone who was born into a working class family where university was sort of an aspiration, I guess, right? My parents and for me, and very much that generation of North American sort of unionized blue collar workers who wanted better for their kids, right? And so I was sent to university, and so why did I get involved in the topic of industrial decline? Well, I saw it around me, right? My father was a railway worker. He was bridged to retirement at age 51. My neighborhood that I grew up in was hollowed out by closure, and yet there was silence around this issue, right? No one was talking about it. Politicians certainly weren't talking about it, and I felt that it was important to challenge that silence. And I think that we don't think of sort of deindustrialization in terms of a form of violence, but it is, right, or it can be. And I find it interesting, the language, like in Germany, because there's been such managed change, you conceive of the issue as Strukturwandel, right, like the structural change, which is, I think, a reflection of your history here, right, of how this process went through. But in North America, it was savage, right? There wasn't a lot of social buffering. And so I think it's that personal place where I that brought me into this field. Like I think most people who work on this topic come from working class families, and so it is a personal project, right? And I do think that feeling, right, is a strong one within the field.
So Marion, what's your take on it? How did you end up in researching deindustrialization?
But I think I have also to explain where I am speaking from. Indeed, I spent my childhood in a former industrial area in the north of France, but the great majority of plants had been closed and my parents are not workers. There are professors or employees, so on. So Deindustrialization in my childhood was in the atmosphere, in the conversation, in the question on the future of the city by the parents of my friends. It was a question, a child question, but not exactly an affective question. It's most a mysterious question. There is also another phenomenon. I have lived and studied in France, and in France, deindustrialization is also a very paradoxical question, like a specter, like a ghost. And after 2 days here in the room, this impression is even more present. What I will say is that in one side, in France, obvious, the deindustrialization is an important issue for its social consequences, for the destiny of some regions, north of France, east of France, close to Germany, and above all, but we will speak about that after, for its political consequences. But at the same time, deindustrialization is almost invisible. And for example, we don't have so many museums, we don't have so many impressive industrial sites were built as heritage. So deindustrialization is a presence, but without recognition and without traces. I think there is many explanation, a part of explanation are in the history of each country. And for France, the glory, the power were not rooted in the industry, but almost in Louis XIV, Napoleon, and so on, Revolution Française, but not industrial revolution. And I think it's a great difference with Great Britain or Germany. And I think there were closures in France, closure in steel industry, closures in coal industry, closures in textile. Often, like in Germany, these closures were softened by the state, were helped by social policies of the state, but it's as if industry has to be disappeared with help, but without leaving traces. And to ask the question if, and it's the same answer than Stephen, if I work on deindustrialization, I think it's exactly for this reason, it's to make the invisible visible, to make the unconscious conscious. And I think from a different point, we go to the same direction.
Hilary.
Okay, so Herren, Damen, good evening. And I just want to say to Stefan and Jana, thank you for your opportunity of feeling uncomfortable, coming back to the terror of this situation, but I will relax into it. So how I got here, how I arrived here on this seat tonight, is quite a long, convoluted story. We don't have time for it, but just to say, I started off as an archaeologist, digging up Roman sites in Britain. And over the years, I've migrated into what's called contemporary archaeology and also heritage studies. Now, contemporary archaeology is interesting because it's mainly dealing with the material traces of the 20th century. And the things that define that branch of archaeology are the speeding up of change within society, but also things around loss and trauma, which of course connects to senses of loss within deindustrializing and deindustrialized communities. Like Stephen and Marion, it's also very personal for me. So my father and my grandfather both worked in the same factory. My great-grandfather came down from Sheffield having worked in the steel industry. And as a young adult, I was living near the coal fields just after the miners' strike, which for me is still an absolute watershed moment in terms of change in British society. And I witnessed, if you like, the effects of the strike on these Midlands industrial communities. And so essentially my interest in archaeology and heritage is about material witnessing and throwing a light, if you like, on working class culture so that we never lose, or hopefully we don't lose an understanding of what that transition was actually felt like as a lived experience and its impact on the landscape. So that's kind of where I come from.
Genau, dann wäre jetzt die Frage, also ich würde es eigentlich an
Right.
beide
So I would actually ask the both of you, because you're working together, but then you have different backgrounds, so you might as well answer individually.
Ich selber
Yes, I personally
bin natürlich an erster Stelle also Filmemacherin oder wir sind
I'm a filmmaker, we're both filmmakers actually,
daher, dass wir einfach
and
Geschichten gerne erzählen.
we just like telling stories.
Geschichten von Menschen und von
We
Dingen.
like telling stories about people and about objects, so why are we working about the industrialization or the change in labor environments? Yes, that's also connected to my background. I was born here in Dortmund, and the garden of my parents was just adjacent to a coke factory. So we made our first film when that coke factory was disassembled and brought to China, and that actually meant that they were carrying away a part of my childhood because our garden was actually adjacent to the premises. So I've got all these nostalgic and maybe stereotyped images in my head of a burning red sky in the evening, and it's just a part of me. So the films we make, they're basically always about things that disappear and the desire to document traces of what is disappearing and to look for what's still there and for what has changed within the people affected by this change and within the environment, like labor culture, social rights. Will they also be eroded when the buildings go? These are questions we've been involved in dealing with for the last 2 decades, and I mean, yes, we live here in the rural area and we love this area. We think it's a very, very interesting area because basically, you know, when I was born, it was just obvious that my father would be involved in the design of the tubes in the steel factories, and like in a very, very fast forward. Now we're in the middle of a rural area that's trying to reinvent itself from scratch. So this is fascinating, first of all. Thank you. I'm also very happy to be here, and I'd just like to add that we are talking about deindustrialization in the sense that we just tell stories about structure change. We don't analyze it. We just tell stories about structural change. We tell stories about people in their everyday lives, in their professions. But we think that as far as we can establish a close relationship with our protagonists and learn about their troubles, what moves them, these topics will automatically be served to you. You don't even have to ask about them. You just have to be open to people and be very accurate in how you approach them.
Yeah, maybe, Stephen, you can relate to that, being someone who has always been talking to people, especially the workers. We're wondering what your take is on being an early actor in this field of deindustrialization studies. What is your take on the internationalization of this field? What does it bring to the table?
Well, it's certainly a field where the central methodology has been oral history. And I think it goes back to this idea of visibilization that Marion was talking about. And I think it's also because, certainly in North America, there's not a lot of archival traces. There's a huge amount of erasure and destruction that's sort of attached to deindustrialization. And so in a way, in order to get at that story, you have to talk to people. And so it becomes very people-centered. And so the field emerged really in North America, I think, and perhaps the UK. In part, I think, because of just the enormity of the moment and just the sheer scale of the destruction, right? Like Detroit becomes this world symbol, I think, of the enormity of these changes. And I think at the beginning, people were grappling with what does this mean, right? Like what's happening here? Why is this happening? And why isn't anyone talking about it, or only talking about it in certain ways, as progress, as post-industrial, sort of accepting it, or not accepting it, and then the field sort of then started to go beyond the closure itself to start to think about the wider significance for communities, right? And I know in Germany you don't use community, and so I don't even know how they would translate it into German. It's like France in that way. And so the field very much sort of shifted towards sort of cultural meaning, right? Like when you lose a factory, when you lose a job, you lose much more than a paycheck. You lose the paycheck, there's the economic hit, but there's also your whole world potentially, it has a crushing impact, right? Both economically, socially, culturally, environmentally, that ripples outward, right, through working class lives. And so I think the field really started to go outward, right, from that sort of ground zero, that moment, that crushing moment of loss, to try to capture the enormity, right? And in our field, we talk a lot about, deindustrialization's half-life. So radiation, we know that there's a long afterlife, right, of radiation, and it's the same with some forms of economic change, right? There's a long tail, right? That it's still like the absence is still present in so many ways. But of course, the last few years you have this, populist revolt, right? You have Brexit, Trump, you have the AfD, you've got this challenge, and you have a debate about where that's coming from. And I think you have many people sort of pointing, suggesting that it's coming from sort of, this sort of deindustrialized sort of place. And I think there's a lot of reductionism in that argument. There's a lot of projection in that argument, in the sense of, okay, where is racism? Okay, it's over there. It's those poor people. Yet there are connections. We see that, and so our wider project is very much, and the conference that's starting tomorrow morning, is very much sort of trying to think about the politics of deindustrialization, right? That it's a political process. That is still here and now, and so yeah, I think where the field is going is very much sort of thinking about the political economy, and going back to maybe those older questions of why, like what's happening here. We know that this is not it's a local story, but it's also a global story, and so scaling up our research becomes very important, right? So trying to think about my hometown of Thunder Bay, Ontario, which was a forestry town. It's not, it's connected to this larger global story. But in scaling up our research, how do we make sure we don't lose that human connection? And I think I think filmmaking does that too in sort of interesting ways. And so yeah, I think I talked probably for too long, but I talked very little my first time because I was very nervous. Yeah. And so, to me, deindustrialization is a form of slow violence, right? That's an everyday violence that is almost, just passes, unrecognizable, right? And I think there's so much work to be done to really, really understand what's going on, but to understand it, to actually do something about it. Yeah.
Okay, that was like a very like dense and like fruitful statement with lots of in it. And I want to come back, I think, to one point in my question to Marion that you touched on, and which is like also in our like project title. It's the politics of our time. And like the obvious, it's always like the elephant in the room, right? So the turn of the working class, maybe of the post-industrial, deindustrialized working class, to the right, to the populist right. And I guess we face this challenge everywhere in all our national contexts. And maybe Marion could say something. I mean, you don't have to like restrict yourself to the French context, but you can maybe you can start from there.
Not only perhaps on the French context, Stefan began to give some elements. I think we can do several observations. The first observation, it's important observation, is that disindustrialization could have had other political effect than occurred. After all, disindustrialization could have led to the strengthening of a struggle, of a class struggle, or to big strikes. And we know that it was the case. There were big social movement against the closure, like in Great Britain in 1984. But we can note that a great part of this movement have been defeated, and we can say that disindustrialization had led to the unmaking of the working class as a political collective. And I think before the populism, the first question is why the political course of disindustrialization was that or not revolution. Or I think many militants in the 70s dreamed that strikes against closures could lead revolution. It was not the case, but why? Before populism, I think the second observation is naturally the crisis of worker organization and of the left parties, which were rooted in the industrial society, trade unions, socialist party, communist party. The crisis is general. Is all the West countries. It's not exactly the same crisis, I think, in Germany, in Spain, in France. In France, it's a disaster, and so on. But it's a general crisis. And if I can talk a bit about the future, it seems to me that if the left-wing parties want to rebuild themselves, the question of their relation with their industrial past and with the experience of disindustrialization is a very, very important question. How to recognize this past, this industrial heritage, without denying it on the pretext of appearing to be a modern left. And I see, we know that forget the industrial past to be a modern left was a very present temptation in many left-wing parties in European. Now, how not to forget, and at the same time, how avoid nostalgia for the good old day. We know that in the deindustrialization, Stefan says that was a slow violence and sometimes hard violence. But industry and industrial period was not an ideal with social, racial and gender inequalities, with environmental destruction, with exhausted work. So the aim is not to back to the industrial society. So what the left do to rebuild a future with a better understanding of the past. And I come to populism, but I think to understand the question of populism, we have to understand the unmaking of the working class and the crisis of the left party, because the three phenomena are connected. Populism, Stephen gives some elements of answer. The great idea is that it's in the former industrial region that the populism or the nationalism, the right-wing nationalism, Rassemblement National and so on, is very high. It's true, is not always true. I think in Italy the situation is quite different. It's not the case in Scotland. So deindustrialization could not lead to populism. And when we say that there is a link between deindustrialization and populism, we have for the moment, no precise explanation. For example, the great waves of deindustrialization took part in Germany, in France, in Great Britain in 70s and 80s. But the rise of populism was 2 or 3 decades after. So it's not obviously the former worker that vote today, perhaps, but we don't know, that vote today for the extreme right, but their children. So it's another kind of experience of deindustrialization. I'm sure that there is a link between deindustrialization and populism, but and it's the reason why we have to work on this subject. It's a more ambiguous link that we could say often in the media or otherwise. Sorry, I'm to speak.
So maybe coming back to something that Marion already mentioned, the heritage and the perception of the heritage, the link to memory and its role in constructing new identities and how we talk about the past. You, as being an expert on the Ruhr as well, I was wondering, because industrial heritage is such a positive thing here in the Ruhr, and it's really linked to tourism and identity building, and it has this really positive image. We have a lot of museums, which is not the case in other regions, other deindustrialized regions. And you already mentioned, or it has been mentioned several times, the strike in 1984. And I was wondering, how is it different in the UK perception of industrial heritage, and why?
Well, that's a very big question. So this has already been raised about structural change in Germany. I think it's actually essential to understand that structural change in the way that process of deindustrialization has been much better managed, I believe, here. That's certainly my perception. So even the use of a term, whereas we talk in the UK about deindustrialization and decline, and so the situation in the UK, speaking very broadly and very generally, is that that similar processes of management of change didn't really happen, that communities were just essentially dumped and dispossessed, and effectively the values of working class lives and culture were dispossessed from the political system, So authors like Owen Jones have written about this extensively, and why then you get majority votes towards Brexit in former working class communities. And so there are similarities. So former workers working still as museum guides, or indeed working in staff at industrial heritage sites in both the UK and in Germany. And so the other thing I want to mention, because I think it's sometimes overlooked, is that speaking as an archaeologist and as somebody that's worked in museums and in the heritage industry, I think it's important to recognise the actual history of that in the UK, because it also links back to the 1980s. So while the traditional, British industries were effectively savaged through the policies of the neoconservative government led by Margaret Thatcher, at the same time that same government was actually had a heritage agenda. And although heritage existed before that period, and certainly where industry, we can talk about the grassroots movements connected to the rise of industrial archaeology, which was mainly looking at the preservation of monuments after the Second World War. But certainly by the 80s, going into the 90s, you have this heritage industry. But it was about the construction and reconstruction of British identity, drawing on ideas of empire and castles and abbeys. And so what started to happen was that this interest in preserving industrial monuments was then brought into this canon of ideas of heritage. And so I think it's important to remember that yes, heritage as a form of social justice is important for former working class communities to remember their past, where they've come from. But at the same time, heritage is a process. There's always winners and losers. There are always people who are excluded and included in those conversations. Because heritage is a process. It's about what we choose and what we select to create ideas of how we see ourselves in the future. And so there's always people who were left out. And much of the conversation this week has been about, who's being left out of this conversation. And so I feel personally conflicted as somebody that has had jobs and employments through the heritage industry, because again, it all connects to me back to the 1980s and what happened. And so yeah, I mean, I don't want to say it, but I've in some way owed my job and my employment to Margaret Thatcher, who is a figure that I I'm going to stop there because it's difficult.
Yeah, thank you. We don't want to go there how that makes you feel, because I think that you're really passionate about that topic as well.
Vielleicht, also jetzt mache ich auf Deutsch wieder weiter, vielleicht aber daran anknüpfen.
I'll continue in English now, maybe continuing there. Marion already said this in her opening statement. It's also about visibility and invisibility. You two, as filmmakers, also deal with making things visible. That's quite concretely speaking your work, but also sometimes not showing certain things or showing them in a different way. I have two questions, namely, first, how would you, with a view to your comparative movie that you just made, how would you assess the differences, in your view, between the visibility of deindustrialized workers or worker communities in the Ruhr area on the one hand, and in the US on the other hand, or to be more concrete, in Bochum and Detroit? And the second question is, how do you approach that? Is your aim to make things visible, or what is your aim?
Uns geht es natürlich sichtbar machen, aber ich würde gerne noch ganz kurz...
We certainly have making things visible as an aim, but I do want to draw on a thought that Marion contributed, which is that it's not to go back to industrialization. That's certainly true, but I do think it's about really facing this entire change. to really understand what really happens when something disappears. If we take an example from our film, when this Opel factory, this workplace is deconstructed in violent processes, violence is expressed there, then that has certain reasons. It may be capitalist efficiency mentality, that maybe that's why the factory is being closed, but it may also be technological change, that the factory can't keep up with technological change. We can certainly discuss that. But what we certainly put a focus on, and that's also why we jumped to the DHL, is that with the disappearance of this building, also certain social structures disappear, certain relations of certain labor relations, certain forms of paid employment that were fought for also by labor unions and that will no longer exist in the case of DHL. And sometimes people say this is nostalgia. Do we want to go back to that way of working? No, of course we don't, because the labor at the conveyor belt at Opel was not good work, both in a physical and a psychological sense, but taking packages from a conveyor belt and putting them in a truck at DHL is also not a good work. And in addition, it's not as well paid as at Opel. So these are things that are important to us, that in the film, the way we juxtapose things in the film, to make that visible.
Ja, und vielleicht konkret zu deiner Frage, es wird oft
so about your question, people usually talk about this film in terms of it being a comparison between the communities in Detroit and Bochum. However, that's not what we meant to do, because we think these two systems and these two cities are just incomparable, because their pasts are just too different. There's a race issue in Detroit that we don't have in Germany in that sense. There are completely different social systems, so we were always very conscious about not making a comparison. Nevertheless, we think there are things that bring these people together, so we wanted to look at what is it that they have in common, these people who have to face a situation where industry just walks off. So what we wanted to do was to cut a parallel montage of stories, of narrations, because a kind of existential work that was providing meaning to people in two different contexts would bear similar results to each of them. Of course, in Germany, there was a social structure that would make people fall softer, definitely. There was a kind of cushion in the social system, but nevertheless, something that you really identified with, that made you proud, right? That you would be an Opelianer, a part of Opel or another factory. When this disappears, of course, there's a big blank in your life. And this big blank, it doesn't only occur when industry disappears. I mean, my father was an industrial worker, but my mother was a shop assistant. And throughout the last 40 years, I've also seen the deterioration and disappearance of this line of work, being a shop assistant. My mother used to be proud, she used to love her work, but as decades progressed, it would get worse and worse. And, you know, the dignity in that job would just go away. So I think there was a parallel loss of dignity for people both in industry and in services. Like my father used to become a day contract worker, and it was difficult for him to just eke out a living. And of course, these processes have led to a situation where our society as well is now being divided into the rich and the poor, and there being a big divide between them. And especially for the children, a lot of opportunities that we would have, or our parents would have, for example, to have a job that would secure your income and actually make it possible to raise a family over 30, 40 years. Has that become impossible? And this is something that we saw on both sides, in both stories we looked at, that people have gone through that, they have suffered that. It's a kind of suffering, actually. And yes, I mean, buildings have disappeared. A lot of former Opel workers are saying they just can't pass there because it hurts them to see that this building is no longer there. And I don't think it's a good thing to say, oh, they're being sentimental. I think we have to take these emotions seriously.
So I think one thing we're all talking about is about visibility and how we can achieve visibility also for the communities in distress. But maybe we can also talk about the idea of a step further. What can we actually do to support those communities, or is it our job to do so? And maybe you can talk a little bit, because now we would like open the round to like more of a discussion situation and not a Q&A, but what can we really do to support? Because one part of the project is also to get involved and not only to have a look at it and describe it. So we can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think recognition is not enough. That recognition is a beginning. I've also seen, like in the North American context, where industrial heritage gets co-opted by gentrification, for example, which then leads to working class residential displacement. So here you have the recognition of the working class past contributing to the displacement of the working class present, yet in the name of industrial heritage. In Montreal, the town that I live in, you've got, we have a person here who's Fred Burrill, who's very involved. It's a malting plant. It's a ruin, and there's a debate about what to do about this site. And the condo developers want to preserve it, right? They will preserve the bricks and mortar, but for who? Whereas the community needs housing, affordable housing, with or without the bricks. And so where does heritage reside? Who's it for? Are very political questions. Never mind like what is being, what's being preserved, right? Like what's the interpretation? Like a lot of industrial heritage, tends to be, consensual narratives, right? That are not lingering in conflict, or some of the hard things that, that people, around the, I want to say table, but around the stage are talking about. There's a great article by Leon Fink talking about industrial heritage in Coolamy, North Carolina, where, that industrial past, not only was it a violent process, but it was also Jim Crow racism, right? And so if we locate, all that is good in the past, what do we do? Yet it's a violent process, right? Deindustrialization. And so recognition is not enough. And I think the other issue I want to just raise is the question of race. So often class is coded as white in public discourse. And it's a product of history, right? Like it's a product of think of slavery and empire, but it's still here in the sense that it structures the conversations and our understandings, and we see that academically, where like who studies deindustrialization is often, as in that frame, right, are often white people, right? Whereas race is another way of understanding another prism to understand change, right? So to me, it's like, how do we bring these two things into conversation, which is a huge challenge, actually. Not only like it's an academic challenge, it's a societal challenge. And how do we talk about these things? How do we find a language that allows us to talk about these things, in relation to each other? And I can go on that, but race to me is one of the most fundamental issues that we face in the study of deindustrialization, right? And I think that's one of the things we are certainly focusing on, over the next years.
Well, we would like to open it up, like in a second. I just have this impression from our discussions right now so far that we have touched on so many crucial issues, but I think what kind of runs around in my head is that question, how it probably builds up on Jana's question from before. What's our impact? How do we actually? What does it really matter if we do this and that research? And who's going to see that movie? Probably the movie is seen by more people than our research is read by people. I think there's always a tension between like our goodwill and the actual impact. And maybe like my final question before we open the floor to everyone. And would be an open question to whoever wants to answer, would be like, how can we make that bridging step? How do we really engage with people and I don't know, is that a question? You know what I mean. Maybe to kind of focus it a bit more. If we think about new social movements that are not necessarily working class, like the climate movement. Like populism claims that there's an opposition between workers' interests or working class interests and the climate movement who want to basically close down industry. So how can we actually make a contribution to bridge this kind of populist argument?
If I can, for the environmental movements, we can stress the fact that the relation between working class and nature and environment is very old. So I think for the new social movement, the experience of the former workers' movement can bring many things, not only for the strikes, not only for the trade unions, but for many motives of struggle, safety, jobs, and so on. So I think that it's difficult to build, but perhaps our work here can help to foster the link between the past world and the future world, because a great part of the worker are always alive, so they can learn to the new activists and so on. And for me, between it's paradoxical, but between some action of coal miners, trade unions in the health or in the security, and actual action on health or on environment, there is a liaison. So I think one of the aims could be to build the bridge and the moving of the experience between the former activists and the former workers and the actual union. They are not two opposite generations. I think there is more connection than opposition.
Can I go next?
Please, yeah.
Okay, just a couple of quick responses to that. I think that I've been seeing a change in discussion in UK, not just academia, but also within the heritage profession recently around industrial heritage. And I think I've been thinking about this quite a bit. And I think what's happening is for our conversations going on around social justice, such as the Black Lives Matters movement, for example, and there are conversations going on around environmental justice. And I hope that those don't become separate camps and that there are conversations that are going to happen between the two. And I think that connects to, in some way, to generational change, and that there are going to be differences of opinion and viewpoint and perception dependent on one's age. You know, I said at the beginning, I remember the aftermath of the miners' strike, for example. And so how we bring together those different perspectives on the Anthropocene and the dark matter of industry, if you like, in conversation with acknowledging the needs of former working class communities or recent working class communities or still living working class communities to express cultures in their own particular way, because that's a fundamental human right. That ability to actually express culture in a way of your choosing. Coming back to the question about how we as academics or practitioners work with different communities, that is such a tricky question, and that runs through, if you like, conversations about co-production or the science shop model of actually not forming the research questions yourself, but actually identifying challenges as presented by different groups in society. And over the summer, I read a very interesting short book by, I'm going to get his surname wrong, so if anybody has a phone, please Google the book with the title Poverty Safari, or if you know the author I'm about to mention, shout it out. Darren McGarvey, thank you. If you haven't read it, I recommend it, because he implicates academics in terms of parachuting into working class communities, treating them as victims, treating them as subjects, and disavowing them of their agency, because much of our conversation on this stage is again, I kind of I recognize that kind of depiction of victimhood. And I think there's a need to recognize that these communities have their own agents and have their own agencies and may not actually need academics. And that we could, I hate to say it, but we may not actually be needed by them. And again, I don't want to do myself out of a job here. But how we deal with that, I think is it's the multi-million-pound question. And what Darren McGarvey says is, if you have a research funding and lots of money, you want to go in and upskill a community group who may be experiencing poverty, why not just give them the money?
What?
Give them the money. But then I wouldn't have a job. It's again, I'm going to say it again, it's complicated, isn't it?
Also in der Dokumentarfilm-Diskussion.
So in the discussion about documentary films, there have been similar approaches and similar questions have been asked. And we too have been depicted as cannibals, as people who eat other people's souls, steal their souls, steal their stories. So there's a lot of discussion about appropriation here, but there's also been a turn in the discussion where people are asking who has the power, who's telling stories from what perspective, who actually generates and produces pictures, whose stories will I tell? Asking this question will will bring a whole new dynamics into film. There's a lot of films that are being made by actual activists and that will lead to social protest, and that activists want to lead into social protest, and this is not the way we want to work. We have taken the decision to tell our stories from the margins about things that are by the by. And we want to allow different perspectives on the well-known stories, for example, of deindustrialization. So, for example, we are talking about minuscule details. The Opel factory, yes, but there's a very, very old acacia tree just standing by that factory, and there's a woman who lives there who's worried about this tree. So first of all you say, what's that about? Why bother? But by the end of the film you can see that the woman's care about the tree can offer us a whole new perspective and allow us to ask the question, what are the not important stories? I mean, the people who are planning, who are managing, who know what the future should be shaped like, they have important stories, we know, but this tree can talk about the menacing aspects of future. For example, someone is painting over the house, so this can be a menace of gentrification looming. And these are things we can incorporate in our stories, and that will allow us to be with the people telling the stories and to create a new mentality of how we react to the big narratives of huge change, and to see how they actually happen in small detail and also affect the hearts of individual people. But yes, we know we're not creating blockbusters, we're not, reaching out to the masses, and also we're not reaching out to the people who are affected by structural change. No, we're part of a bubble that's called art house cinema, and we can't go beyond that. So one important aspect is to make this whole issue of structural change emotionally experienceable. So, without falling into nostalgia, to see how change has really brought a lot of change to people. If you're like 50 and you lose your job and don't know if you find a new one, then this is a source of pain. So, change has a lot of important aspects, but in the Ruhr area we like to actually talk about the lighthouse processes. We put them at the center of the conversation, but I think we should dare to say no, change has to do with grief, with the work of mourning, the labor of mourning. And a lot of people have been affected by this labor of mourning, and we have to include this in our films. Our work wants to make the emotional side of change experientiable and maybe contribute to a discourse.
I think I found it really interesting what Hilary said, because maybe no one is really waiting for us or our research, and we definitely also have to talk about how not diverse our group of researchers is, and how we can also open up this project, which we already started, but I think that's also like a critical point. I would now like to open up the discussion for questions, to also get other opinions and perspectives in. And we welcome you to ask questions and discuss with the podium as well.
We've got 2 microphones, like one on each side, but here's a question.
So my question is for Michelle and Ulrike. In your recent film, why did you choose to use so many interviews and stories of small business owners as depictions of the communities that were impacted by the closure of the auto plants?
Ja, dieser Aspekt ist uns sehr, sehr wichtig, weil ich meine...
This aspect is very important to us, because if When big industry vanishes, then a lot more vanishes that is around that. Social structures disappear. And for instance, this retail store in Detroit, the hardware store that got into trouble through online trade after 100 years in a family ownership, that's a lot more. It was a social institution. You could go there, buy 3 screws, and talk about your family for an hour. Of course, that becomes obsolete through online trade. So it's really important to us that we show these structures in the context of deindustrialization, because they also vanish.
Hi, my question is also for the filmmakers. I was also wondering about how the characters were framed in the interviews, kind of in this way where it felt very different in the kind of chaotic environment of the people who seemed to be in a lower class element. So the farmers, the waitress, and the hardware store owner versus the people who were more professional class, who were framed in this more kind of stable and serene environment. And I was wondering how much of that was on purpose and how much of that you want to reflect about now, because I was really curious.
Also von der Bild ist die Frage von der Bildsprache.
Is the question about the imagery, about the images used? Because we try to approach everyone with the same look, with the same curiosity, because we approach people and look at who wants to show us what story each person wants to tell us. Over the years, we decided that we only make films about people who we really like. And so I think the approach is the same for everyone, that we look at who is sharing what about themselves and in what form are they sharing that. And that's how our images come about and our exchange with people. It's always a give and take. Also, as a filmmaker, you give a lot at the point where you meet the person or you open up. You always open up mutually, otherwise it doesn't work.
I think it's really interesting that there are now 2 questions for the filmmakers, but none for the academics. So, but there's another question.
Hello. This question is I guess a little bit more for the academics, but it's for everyone. So it's building on Marion's provocative idea about how to rebuild the future, and I just wanted to know, I mean, concretely speaking, if you're not going to go back to industrial times like you've said that you won't or you can't, then what lessons from studying change through the challenging times of deindustrialization and through cherishing and valuing working class experiences and cultures, what then would you rebuild? What are the ingredients? What would that look like? Looking not only to the past and to the present, but to the future.
I can try. We have yesterday in our summer institute a workshop on energetic transition, and the aim of the workshop was to think about past energetic transition, in this case the transition from coal to oil, to understand the way of more inclusive ecological and energetical transition. And you know that today we have to do quickly big energetic transition. So I think there is no model in the past, it's true, but there is experience, successful experience or failed experience. And for example, for this question of energetic transition, the question is how to manage the change. And we know that today we have to manage this change with an inclusive manner, because we know that the transition, for example, today from carbon energy to green energy will destroy jobs. We know that in petrochemistry and Hazo. So how to do to manage this kind of transition with social justice, with inclusion, and with taking care of the memory of the population. So I think there is in industrial history and in the management of the deindustrialization process some experiences to lead the major changes who will challenge in the further decades.
Only to say I just agree with what Marion said. I think that's very well put. And yes, it certainly shouldn't necessarily be material or fabric or objects, because ultimately all of that is going to return to the soil. So it has to be about those can I say communities, because I know it's not acceptable in France or Germany, but those communities, those communities of form around work.
We actually always say community, like the English term. We use the English term community.
I want to be a bit more confident as academics and as filmmakers, and I like your film a lot. I think we can beat ourselves up all we like, but who gets to tell those stories if we don't? Right-wing journalists who want to have to get clickbait. Steve talked about slow storytelling on Slow Academia yesterday. And I think we need to be braver about saying, of course, there are academics who do drive-by. Of course there always have been. But we mustn't be silenced in the same way that filmmakers mustn't be silenced to be critical and ask critical questions. And just because I know the book, and I actually got some time for the guy who did the poverty safari thing, but we can't all be silenced by and give money to these communities, because they're not going. Let's be realistic. They're not going to get that money. But it's because we make critical dialectic interventions that problematize, that ask questions, ask critical questions, and keep these communities, these industries, and what happened in the forefront, that change might happen. So I've always thought that my work's been about, if nothing else, bearing witness. And there's a record there that if people care to follow up, it will problematize a set of events and history, so that one narrative, the Thatcherite narrative, which is very, very strong still, about the coal strike or about deindustrialization. In Britain, we now have a Conservative Party that's being voted for by the very communities that were deindustrialized by their actions. And because there is not a stronger alternative Labour Party or left critique, because they've ceded that ground, because Thatcher was right, we now have a situation where those very communities are now ostensibly blaming the left for having been deindustrialised by their policies, when the Conservatives have been in power for, I do know the number of years they've been in power, since 1945, but they are responsible for this. So I think we should not be silenced, and we should not say it's a council of despair, what can we do? I think we do important work. That's not to say that we can't do it better, or some people are doing it badly, but we need to be more confident. So I'd like to hear a response, but it's up to you.
No, I'm happy to respond, and I mean, you know, I'm sitting here and maybe pushing some buttons, but it was a book that I read recently, and I have to take on board what Darren McCarvey said, you know, because I see this in terms of work I do in academia. You know, we get a pot of money and then we try to work out how to upskill and spend it, you know. But I think you're right. I mean, I think for me that I just have to recognise that I am different people to different people, and that some people hopefully will appreciate the work that I do and gain positive value from it. But for other people, then I'm not going to be. I'm going to be somebody else. And I don't have a problem with that. I actually feel quite comfortable with that position that I'm not going to be important to everybody on the planet, and that and I have to make the decisions and self-reflect in terms of what I believe is the best course at the present time, looking both to the past but also looking to the future. So all I'm advocating here is for self-reflection, but that's not necessarily something I'm preaching to the converted, because we fundamentally self-reflect and reflect with each other all the time, as we're doing tonight. I don't disagree with you, Tim, and I don't feel unconfident about the work that I do. I'm just trying to recognise that I'm not going to be all things to all people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Alice Ma had asked a question earlier, and she wrote a fantastic article on sort of the ethics of doing this kind of research, right, with deindustrialized communities. And I think one way forward is through collaboration, right? That to try to break that academic gaze of I know your problem better than you do, right? And to be in conversation, with the communities that we work with and study, and to be accountable in ways. And so I'm not pessimistic at all, but I think how we're doing research is changing, right? And has needed to change for a long, long time. And I think oral history, is well positioned in that change, in the sense that oral history, and sort of, I think in terms of the best documentary tradition too, right, it is sort of dialogical, right? Like you're learning with people, and it's that back and forth that allows you to break that sort of projection, right? And so I'm with Tim on I don't think we should apologize for being an academic, but I do think we need to change what it means to be an academic.
Hi there. Well, first off, thank you all for this lovely discussion. My question is prompted by the filmmakers, though I would love the academics to respond to this in the context of their own work, and I think it dovetails quite nicely into what Tim was talking about. I watched the film last night, as did many, and one of the things that kind of struck me, I was a bit reminded by, I forget which one of you, and I'm sorry, I forget the names, mentioned about how, as filmmakers, you're part of the film, and interviewing these people, you open up to them sometimes in much as they open up to you, and in doing oral history interviews, it's a similar kind of thing. But I was still struck in the film that the filmmakers themselves weren't necessarily in it, and it was often often, if not almost always, if I remember correctly, the documentary participants speaking directly to the camera, right? And you didn't have that sort of dialogic choice. So I'd like to hear from the filmmakers a little bit about why you made that choice. And then also more broadly, the question of, at what point do we pull ourselves back, and at what point do we pull ourselves in to the work, I guess. So, yes, thank you.
Ja, vielen Dank für die sehr spannende
Thank you very much for the very interesting question. If I say that we also open up ourselves, then I don't mean that we have to be in the picture immediately, or that we have to be in an open dialogue directly. A lot of human interaction takes place behind the camera and around the scene. Often one goes to the people first without a camera, gets to know them and earns their trust, and so on. For me, it's that we generate images, and then afterwards we work with those images a lot. So we transform, so to speak, speak, these documentary images into a very subjective work of art. It's a very subjective film that we worked on for years, where we discussed for hours whether we make the cut here or 3 frames later. And this work is what we do as filmmakers. This is us. That's our comment, our position, and also our political attitude. So you see, without us saying whose side we're on or whom we embrace, you will notice where our sympathies lie and where our political will lies and where we think that people are being left behind or where things could be done differently. That doesn't mean that we don't make mistakes or that we couldn't be more clear in one or the other place. But what's important to us is that everyone who sees the film sees a different film. Films always have a lot of space where you can appear yourself as a person watching the film, where you find yourself with your own history. And through that, the films are not always crystal clear. We don't give clear-cut answers. We don't know how the future will work or how we need to shape the future to have a better world. Maybe I would have become a politician if I had that, or I would have had some other job. What we see our task to be is to document this and also turn it into a piece of art that will last, that will not be there ephemerally, but will last. And I very much thank Tim for your comment that we are witnesses. That's something that's very important to me. And that we don't leave, we must not and should not leave that field to others who have a different view. It's important that we also set political that we put forth political statements with this.
Oh, 2 questions. 3, 4 questions. My God.
So we've been talking about witnessing, which makes me think about the Trinidadian intellectual C.L.R. James talking about, observing and recording rebellious tendencies or revolutionary tendencies within working class communities, but not just witnessing, pushing and challenging. And so I want to ask you all about imperialism, because the solid working class lives that you're discussing in the different contexts in Germany and in the UK and in France and in North America, all of those depended on imperialism. And so I wonder, how do we deal with this when we're talking to people about their pasts, and how do we push them to say that the past that was solid for you in fact depended on the precarity of others, and yes, that's it.
Thank you. Just reflecting on these really interesting and great conversations, I had a couple of concepts or words that maybe it'd be great to get even just a short reflection on, and they are service and care. I, as well as my academic work, I work a lot in community organising and do a lot of work around oral testimonies, but also kind of participatory campaigns, arts campaigns, and campaigns for change with people using food banks in Manchester. And we kind of find ourselves almost inventing a best practice off the hoof, because we don't really have a frame of how to bring our expertise in. But the way we kind of starting to think about it is, how do you make the academic, the historian, the curator, the expert, the servant of the community? But also, in order to do that, you need to often create the infrastructure that allows people to take direction and control, and maybe that's a community of care. So yeah, service and care.
So 2 very different kinds of questions. Maybe the big one first. or whatever, and whoever wants to answer to that.
Well, I'm giving a paper on this topic at the conference where I'm looking at a mining community in Canada, in a northern region of Canada. And so you have colonialism is bound up in industrialization, right? The mill is basically pushing sort of not only the industrial frontier, a white power structure, right? Where it gets, where you have a mining community where it's like a suburb in the wilderness for white people, and indigenous people are in shacks on the edges without water and sanitation, without permanent jobs, right? And so they get the odd bits and pieces, the crumbs, right? And so like, how do we recognize wider structures and also wider temporalities that are not just behind us but still very much present, and I think this is a very challenging issue, and I think it's a struggle, right, to do this, but so important, right? And that a victim or victimization can also be a perpetrator, right? That is, actually very common, right? Perpetrator not as maybe as an individual, but that we're all positioned in some way. My critique of like bearing witness is that the danger of that is that it suppresses, your own positionality, right? Your own presence. It's all about them. It's all about them. But of course, you're interpreting them, right? And so to me, we have to always think about that gap between, the researcher or the witness or whatever, and the people whose experience this is. And that's a very political thing. And so I think we have to be in the frame, maybe not the film frame, right? But we have to, it's a huge part of the process, right? And if you sort of pretend that this is just them, it's unmediated, you are part of the problem, in my opinion, because you're not engaging with that very difficult issue, right? Anyways.
Anyone else on that? And also on the other question about care and community?
On the second question, may I do a shout out for a scholar whose work I very much admire, Chantal Carr, who's based in Australia, and she's been doing some really great work looking at exactly that, or at least what I think you're talking about, and looking at how, if you like, knowledge and skill and concepts of care are taken from the workplace back into families, and I'm going to use a word again, communities. And so, I would, again, if you're not familiar with her work, I would say she's somebody to look out for.
There were two last questions, I think, maybe even a third one, but maybe we can just really now collect them and then wrap it up.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Nicky Stubbs from University of Sheffield. I was really interested, I think it was Tim that made a point about the Conservatives being in power for much of the last century, and overseeing that process that I guess in many ways is similar to what you were describing, Stephen, in North America. It wasn't managed, it was actually quite savage. I'm from a small village called Grimethorpe at the edge of Barnsley, and there was about a 15-year period between the closure of industry and when jobs started to come back. And for much of that, that was a Labour-run council. It was under a new Labour government, and of course a lot of that money that funded that reconstruction came from the European Union. So I guess the question is, if we understand recent political developments such as Brexit, such as Trump, as I guess the mobilisation of anger, then where does that anger come from? I think this is a really serious question. Does it come from the experience of deindustrialization itself, the moment of industrial closure, or does it come from that longer term process of reconstruction So I just wanted to pose that and see what the panelists thought.
Thank you. I'm so impressed by the film, and then I would like to know about the characteristics of that you have considered for those choosing those interviews among the working class families.
So this question is about the politics of deindustrialization and the future, and it was triggered a bit by what Marion said, although it's directed to anyone. I guess for a long time there was an assumption that cities like Bochum or Detroit were going in one direction, that there would just be continued industrial decline. But now, if you read the newspaper, pick up the Financial Times, you see words like deglobalization, decoupling, so particularly from OECD countries, from Chinese global value chains. In the COVID response package for Japan, the government paid its companies a significant amount of money to move operations out of China. The US is now subsidizing certain sectors. And Christine Lagarde, the ECB director, last week or 2 weeks ago said that in the future, companies will not make location decisions on the basis of low-cost labor or other factors of production, but on geopolitics. So the question is there scope for some of the communities that you research to reindustrialize, maybe for the first time in decades? And more importantly, if so, what role can deindustrialization studies play in a progressive politics of reindustrialization? Because I could imagine it could be quite nationalistic, anti-China, new Cold War, etc.
Ja, die Frage war, soweit ich das verstanden habe.
As far as I understand, how did we choose the protagonists we interviewed? How did we establish contact with them? We're not doing this like from our desk. We're going to places that we think are interesting, but mostly it's about luck and random encounters. And you meet people where you say, something could emerge from this, some kind of relationship, because these people are ready to turn their inside out, to say that we think that what they have to say is authentic. Whether that's right or not, it's up to you as the spectator to decide. But for us, it's really the first encounter. For example, that car mechanic, the engineer, we just wanted him to show Detroit, right? To show us the city. But when he did so, we saw that he really was living the memory of the city. So we said maybe he could become a protagonist in our film. Then we have encounters where we think, no, this person isn't really delving deep enough. We will only learn about the surface, and these encounters may not make it into the film. And then we have encounters where people just don't want us to approach him. For example, in Bochum, the planning experts, they just wanted us to, advertise for them. They didn't want to really divulge themselves to us. So we have said, well, but this is an open-end project. And the planners, they just said, well, come on, if they paint a bad picture of us, or if actually this process of what we're planning is going bad, this is not good for us. We wanted them to show how they grapple with the process they were involved in. And when they didn't allow us to do that, we didn't really make them big in the film. But the hardware store owner just was a very genuine person, and he had a very caring relation with the farmer. So we thought this kind of relation can really make our film richer, and this is how we focus. We decide to focus on it. Thank you.
Okay. As Marion was already picking up.
Only two things for the two questions. On the question of populism, I completely agree. It's not an immediate experience of deindustrialization. Is almost true. Is a memory of deindustrialization, or again transmission to the children. And I think the great issue for the studies on this subject is to understand what is the process. And it's not easy to understand. For the question on reindustrialization, I think it's a very good question I don't know if academics and especially historians could give advice to lead an economic and social process. The only thing that I can say is that historian academics can note that if there is reindustrialization, it won't be the industry as before, not the plants as before, and not the working class as before, because imperialism, mondialization, and so on. So, and I think the second question is how to make an industrialization or reindustrialization without inequity, without exploitation, without exhausted work. I don't know if when political leaders and so on speak on reindustrialization, I don't know if they are thinking about all the consequences. So I think, again, there is no models in the history, but we can note that if we want a fair reindustrialization, we have to avoiding the inequities and the exploitation of nature and so on of before. So it's a great challenge.
Stephen and Hilary, do you want to talk about where the anger comes from or about reindustrialization?
Yeah, no, I think I agree with Marion. I guess maybe one issue I would want to bring up is that what we saw in the 1970s and 80s and 90s in North America in particular was also de-unionization, right? And I think what people are lamenting is the loss of a good-paying job and a sense of security and maybe belonging and again, it's not everyone that has access to this, right? And that is an exclusive thing in a way, right? Because there's loads of precarity around that. But I think the people who are invoking that are invoking that idea, and it is not a bad thing to invoke. Like, it's an aspiration. Like, people should expect or hope or desire to have that kind of stability, right? And not that kind of precarity. And so if that is a motivating fiction or if that's a myth, right? It can still be a motivating thing in terms of the future, in terms of mobilizing. And so North America to me is just again, and I think Marion mentioned it earlier, is just the crushing of working class organizations and what that has meant. And we're living with that. Like in Canada, we have a much higher rate of unionization than the United States, but it's mainly because of the public sector. And even now, the public sector is targeted. Seeing that, that in a big way. So you're seeing some of the things that employers did in the private sector now being applied very much in the public sector. And so I think we can learn a lot from the past, right? But it's going to be contested and it's going to take struggle, right, to have that kind of future we're talking about.
I would say that in one of the areas that I've both lived and done research, and I'm talking about Cornwall in the United Kingdom, that's been very closely associated with China clay extraction as well as copper, tin, arsenic, etc. I've been following with interest reports about lithium mining, and it will be interesting to see whether, as that develops, whether it is again tied in with concepts of Cornish nationalism and identity, So I don't have an answer for that yet. And then there was another point I was going to make, but I'm quite tired now, and it's just escaped my head. Oh yeah, I haven't yet I've been talking about reading a bit, and I haven't yet done the reading or got my head around the whole degrowth literature. So if anybody has done any reading on degrowth and as another way forward into the future, then I would be very interested to talk to you, because I'm aware that some friends have been reading around degrowth and what that could mean, what that could look like in the future. That's all I've got to say. I'm not going to say anything else, unless I have a beer in my hand.
Okay, I think that was a call for the end. There's this one term in my head right now that like came up over the last few days and also in your film, and that's the word dilemma. And I think it's quite interesting that we, like the majority here probably on the panel is, well, I wanted to say they are historians, but actually it's like half of them are historians. But nonetheless, people who engage with the past, but now we've been talking a lot about the future and what perspectives of the future could be. And then, I mean, we are apparently in this dilemma, how can we change the system? And we have always these discussions about kind of being social democrat and reform capitalism, or can we overcome capitalism? And in the end, we will stick with this kind of tricky question. So I think we are going to talk about this from various perspectives tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, and probably for years and years to come. And we can I don't know, meet again at some point and re-stage this here and talk again. So thanks a lot for all the discussions.